Okay, welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to have every one of you here on a Friday afternoon. Anyways, so I will get to the point quickly so we can hear all your voices. Uh, so, in order to understand what we mean by decolonization, we have to first understand what colonization means. So, colonization involves taking control of an area or a country that is not your own, especially using force and sending people from your own country to live or rule there. I'm not getting into the whole spiel about colonization, but we know there are different forms of colonialism, like settler colonialism that happened in the US, or non-settler colonialism, like the prime example being India. Anyways, so according to Merriam-Webster dictionary, colonization is subjugation of a people or area, especially as an extension of state power. It is the act or practice of appropriating something that one does not own or have a right to, and that's where we are coming from. So, what is decolonization? So, decolonization is kind of an unlearning process. It means to free a people or area from colonial status, to relinquish control of subjugated people or area, which historically speaking, we witnessed from the middle of the 20th century following the two world wars. For our pedagogical purposes, the act or practice of decolonizing involves a mental decolonization, that is the shedding of the values imparted by the colonizers. And you should understand that these colonizers, they are more symbolic terms. It refers to anybody who dominates, and the shedding of the values imparted by the colonizers, this mental colonization, these ideas come from a famous Algerian thinker and writer and activist. He was actually a doctor by profession, Frantz Fanon. uh, but we also have to, while we think about colonization, we also have to think about not just as an external force, but also there are many forms of internal colonization that we see in the context of India, for example, or in the context of present day US, where they embody institutional, social, structural inequities, okay, and discriminations. So, how do we decolonize the curriculum? We decolonize the curriculum. First of all, decolonizing the curriculum means to identify, challenge, and revise or replace assumptions, ideas, values, and practices that reflect the dominating influence of the colonizer, and especially the Eurocentric views. So, a decolonized curriculum emphasizes diversification and inclusion, the two terms that you are hearing frequently these days. Uh, Decolonizing the curriculum also recognizes that knowledge is marked or produced by a relationship of power. So, hence, a few weeks ago, you all heard about this, subaltern archive. So, where we are challenging how we construct an archive and how we read them, and how there are numerous possibilities of creating your own archive so that we challenge the existing knowledge base. One of the prime examples, as I was thinking about this, sharing with you, with primarily my students in mind, is the work by the anthropologist called Eric Wolf, who wrote this book, Europe and the People Without History. So in the 1980s, when this decolonizing process first started, without gaining so much momentum in the media or the Wolf challenged the notion advocated by European anthropologists that non-European cultures and perhaps peoples were isolated and static before the advent of European colonialism and imperialism. So, ironically, referring to the non Western people as a people without history, Wolf showed that these societies, before active colonization, possessed a very dynamic and reactionary cultures, and they were intertwined to the process of the pre Columbian global economic system. as their European counterparts. So it's not as if they were lacking a culture. So what does the decolonized curriculum do? Decolonized curriculum, therefore, brings in the questions of class, caste, age, gender, ability, age, and sexuality, religion, ethnicity. We could add on the variables in conversation with one another. It disrupts the homogenizing and centralizing tendency of the colonial narrative, such as the West versus the non-West, first world versus the third world, so on and so forth. Also, what it does, and again, it all happened in the past 50 years, it brings the colonizer and the colonized in the same field of knowledge and analysis. So the colonized is not separate from the colonizer. We cannot disentangle the history of the two. So that was the mission of the new scholarship. At the same time, while doing this, this new literature, this new scholarship also recognizes the tension that underlies the relationship between the rulers and the ruled, the dominant and the subordinate groups of population. So in some sense, broadly speaking, in today's parlance, decolonizing curriculum is a part of the recent social justice movement that owes its origins to the neo-Marxist criticisms and the post-modernist challenges that delineated the diffused but direct connection between power, knowledge, and culture. So to draw on a decolonized curriculum, we draw on a body of scholarship that emerged in the past 50 years, and we continue to participate new and emerging scholarships. The book, the seminal work that really created a great impact on the field is Edward Said's Orientalism, which was written in 1978, and which really shook up our entire thought process of how we used to think. And he pointed out the assumptions and binaries between the East versus West, feminine versus masculine, that underlie the ideas of Western modernity. So similar critiques were also launched by feminist scholars, especially those of color, who a prime example of a Marxist, feminist, deconstructivist critic, also a close ally of Edward Said, is Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak. And Spivak furthermore advocated the dismantling of disciplinary boundaries. So here Said, he is no more with us, but he was very much a public intellectual and a resident of New York City. He wore many hats, but I would just confine him to his monumental work, Orientalism, where he challenged the stereotypes propagated by authors like Rudyard Kipling, who not only wrote such poems as White Man's Burden, but also, his ideas could be encapsulated in what I put down here: East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet. So this very strong compartmentalization between what is called West and what is called East. Okay. Okay, I added also a couple of pictures of Spivak. She's still teaching at Columbia University and holding workshops, actually teaching workshops on decolonizing pedagogy. Columbia is hosting such session. Professor Mancia probably knows about it every few Fridays. So she wrote, actually she's someone who popularized the deconstructivist thought in the US by translating Derrida, but she has tremendous amount of scholarship, and these are some of her works that are relevant for us here. I just cited two. So I thought, because I'm talking about it, I should familiarize you a little bit with Indian historiography, so that I think, when we think about decolonizing curriculum, Indian history is good to think with. So in the field of Indian history, and I'm going to give you a very, very brief snapshot of what happened in the writing of Indian history. Why? One, because India was emerging as a decolonized power after more than 200 years of subjugation of British colonial rule. So when India was coming of age in the wake of its independence, a new branch of scholarship, particularly of looking at Indian history, emerged. And I'm going to talk, there are many different strands of writing Indian history, but I'm just going to talk about one, which made, again, a serious intervention in the field of scholarship, which is directly connected to decolonizing curriculum. So in the field of Indian history, a group of scholars under the leadership of the historian Ranajit Guha launched a new board of investigation called the Subaltern Studies. And that again, emerged in 1982. They were greatly inspired by the French philosopher Michel Foucault, the Italian Marxist thinker Antonio Gramsci, and Edward Said. Eventually, Said became a team member of the Subaltern Studies collective, so to say. So the approach of the Subaltern Studies was nothing new in the writing of history, so to say. But in the context of India, they brought to the fore the contribution of Indian peasantry and other marginalized groups in history. And so their approach is very much bottom up, or history from below. They also argued that it is impossible to understand Indian history without taking into consideration the autonomous history of lower social groups. So, and they also rejected the existing scholarship based on official sources as elitist. So they were definitely calling for alternate sources. So just for some visualization, I know most of you are visual learners, so I made a special effort to include pictures. So this is Ranajit Guha, still living, very, very old. And these are some of his works. There are many, many more under his hat, but I just picked out a few. Another thinker who makes a real difference and who's very important for us in the present moment is Dipesh Chakraborty, who teaches at the University of Chicago. And he's also one of the founding members of Subaltern Studies when it first emerged, and a young scholar just coming out with his PhD. But he was particularly effective in demonstrating on how to decolonize our mind. In his first book, Rethinking Working Class, which came out in 1989, he engaged with the leading Marxist historian, E.P. Thompson, to show that Marxist notions of capital and the working class are inadequate for understanding the Indian working class, whose lives were characterized by pre-capitalist relationships or by the absence of notions of citizenship, individualism, or equality before the law. Now, these parlance of modern institutions of state power, citizenship, individualism, it pervaded the Indian social reality in the colonial times, it's true. But how much that pertained to the Indian working class working in the jute mills is a matter of question. So what the scholars posited, and especially Dipesh Chakraborty, and along with him, another major scholar who I did not discuss here is Partho Chatterjee, they posited the question of colonial difference, okay, that we cannot use the same yardstick for measuring the West versus the East India. But Chakraborty subsequently came up with another major thesis that kind of, I think, underscores this whole notion, intellectual notion of decolonizing the curriculum. In his subsequent works, and particularly in a seminal article that he authored in 1992, the book came out much later. The article was called Provincializing Europe, India and the Artifice of History, which came out in a major journal called Representations that comes out from the University of California, Berkeley. Chakraborty presented a very, very unique but insightful, extremely insightful thesis. In the first place, Europe for Chakraborty and for all of us who are trying to think about decolonizing, it's an imaginary figure. And why? And more so in the context of South Asian history. Why? Because Europe is a figure that remains deeply embedded in the everyday practices and thoughts of ordinary Indians. or South Asians. Why? Because being under colonial control for so many years and being immersed in Western kind of thinking that was imparted through education, Western notions of individualism, Western notion of reason, of empathy, notions that emerge from post-Enlightenment philosophies, they pervade Indian practices and knowledge. But in the context of thinking political modernity, which is the rule of the modern institutions of the state, bureaucracy, capitalist enterprise, the notions of citizenship, equality, and rule of law, the influence of European Enlightenment looms large. Nobody in the Indian subcontinent or South Asia can ignore these modern notions of state power. Therefore, Chakraborty proclaims there is no easy way of dispensing with the universals that are associated with political modernity that was ushered in by Europe in non-Western colonized countries such as India. So I'm not going to talk about Enlightenment. Here are the Enlightenment experts in the panel, but this is what Chakraborty proclaimed, and I quote him. European thought is both indispensable and inadequate in helping us to think through the various life practices that constitute the political and the historical in India. So we cannot easily dismiss Europe, okay? So Europe has to be there, but we also have to understand the difference. So this is Chakraborty and his 2 books. He also has several other works, but I'm citing this too. And my 2 bits. So for me, to decolonize curriculum is not to reject or eliminate the imaginary Europe altogether, but to understand its indispensability and inadequacy and the historical difference in context. We historians, those of my students who are here, I emphasize context and more than anything else. So context is very, very important. We have to understand the difference in historical context when we think about Europe and basically calibrate our understanding of history accordingly. So to decolonize the curriculum is a 2-way process that challenges the binaries, and it also emphasizes a shared past. So for example, and I can speak on the second point forever, and I'll be happy to handle them in the Q&A, but I just want to cite one example. So in my course on women in Indian history, now what I have started doing as a part of this decolonizing effort is that I let my students explore the history of American or European women first, so to set up a big understanding of where we're coming from, but during the same period of time. So we have a larger picture of what, in a global map where we map women's roles, positions, struggles, and put it in comparison with what was happening in other parts of the world. So I also propose a comparative and global perspective, of course, combined with the attention to race, class, gender, and sexuality, and I think these are effective ways to decolonize the curriculum. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Banerjee. So that was a magisterial survey of sort of theory and history, and is the kind of work that you do in History 2001, the historian's craft. So I just want to tell you, if you haven't taken 2001 and liked thinking like that with Professor Banerjee, that's what's on the agenda for you in that class. And I also put some other classes in the chat that are on offer next spring that deal with decolonization directly or indirectly in one way or another. So we're going to move on to Professor Remy. Professor Remy is going to talk about how he has decolonized a single class. So take it away, Professor Remy.
Thank you, Lauren, and thanks as always for organizing this. And thank you all for attending. And as always, I learned a great deal from my colleague, Professor Banerjee. So look, for me, decolonizing the curriculum entails breaking out of the intellectual confines imposed on Western historiography and historical methodologies by imperialism and colonialism. So to be more specific, first, it entails rethinking the past in fundamental ways. ways that acknowledge but do not privilege the colonizers. And here I'm going to be repeating some of what my colleague said. Second, it entails conceiving all human subjects of our inquiries. That's the colonizer and colonized alike. Again, with acknowledging the need to break out of binaries, but conceiving all human subjects of our inquiries as fully human. So as my Graduate Center colleague Dagmar Herzog put it, the imperative is to practice radical empathy without sentimentality. I like the way that she put that. Third, for me, it entails rethinking how we periodize the past. So the 1619 Project is a good example of this in another context. In my case, to cite two recent examples, we're always taught that World War I took place between 1914 and 1918. But the fact is, more Europeans, this is just in European context, died in armed conflict between 1918 and the early mid-1920s than did between 1914 and 1918. Yet we're always taught that World War I ended in 1918. A more relevant example is that we still learn, you're all taught, that World War II took place between 1939 and 1945. But from the perspective of China, this periodization makes almost absolutely no sense. Okay, and I talk about that in my course. Fourth, for me, decolonizing the curriculum entails not only reconsidering the past for its own sake, but also as a way to think about different kinds of futures. So I was struck by the way that the Princeton political scientist Rob Nixon put it when he was a Hess scholar at Brooklyn College some years ago. If you want a different kind of future, you have to think differently about the past. So maybe to put it another way, as historians, our responsibility now is not to wallow in nostalgia about greatest generations, and to serve up plates of historical comfort food, but to derail the familiar and comforting narratives about the past. I think that's our obligation to the future. Okay, so as one of my mentors used to say when I was a graduate student, that sounds impressive, Remy. What does it mean? So what does it look like in practice in our classrooms? So let me describe very briefly what I've attempted to do by creating two new courses for undergraduates and graduate students. Courses called The Imperial World at War. In this course, what I'm doing is proposing a radical rethinking of much of world history from roughly the mid-1800s through at least the 1970s. And the basic idea is straightforward. Beginning around the middle of the 1800s, wars to create, expand, defend, and resist colonial projects accelerated all around the world. I think these conflicts amounted to a world war. And what we have traditionally considered World Wars I and II were offshoots of this larger and longer global conflict. Now, why have we separated colonial wars and world wars in the Western historical imagination? I think there's a number of reasons, but I think it's mainly because we still privilege so-called great wars between great powers over colonial wars. Now, this distinction is not new. It was drawn in a hugely influential book about colonial wars written by a British officer named Charles Caldwell and published in 1896. He called colonial wars small wars. And he intended this book to be a guide for a kind of field guide for colonial armies. And in his words, a guide for what he called disciplined soldiers fighting, and I'm quoting him here, savages and semi-civilized races who refuse to engage with regular armed forces on the open field. All right. Now, most white Anglo-Americans and Europeans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they accepted Caldwell's distinctions between regular wars and small wars. Now, in the second half of the 20th century, small wars got renamed. We get counterinsurgency wars, we get irregular wars, or we get the particularly grotesque low-intensity conflict. The problem is that most historians have maintained this distinction between great wars and small wars, even if they have abandoned the overtly racist assumptions that underpinned Caldwell's characterizations. So for me, decolonizing the curriculum in this context means challenging this distinction and rethinking what we mean by world war. So in my course, I propose that four factors connect the hundreds of armed conflicts fought in and over imperial spaces, making them a world war. The first is scale and simultaneity. Second is methods and means. The third is related to the second, and that's one that's getting a lot of attention from historians right now, and that's environmental warfare. It's often getting referred to now as ecocide. And the fourth is transnational ideologies of supremacy and resistance. So let me say something very quickly about each of these, and then I'll stop. So first, scale and simultaneity. So if looked at globally, really beginning around the middle of the 1800s, 19th century, there was a kind of belt of war that encircled the world. And these conflicts were generated by the accelerating expansion of European, American, and also Japanese empires. So this expansion provokes indigenous resistance that provokes even greater levels of violence by imperial powers. So we see this in North America. We see it in parts of the Caribbean. We see it across nearly all of Africa. We see it with Imperial Russia in Central Asia. We see it with the Ottoman Empire on the Arabian Peninsula and the Balkans. And of course, we see it in substantial parts of South and Southeast Asia. We see it also in Australia and New Zealand. So this really is a global belt of conflict. And then, of course, there's Japanese expansion increasingly at the expense of China and also on the Korean Peninsula. Second, methods and means of war fought by both sides. So if you start with the imperial side, you have technological superiority, right? In weapons, transportation, communication, food preservation, medicine. These were the most important. All of these made imperial expansion possible. They didn't always guarantee the victory of imperial forces. And imperial forces had to learn to fight in dangerous environments over vast expanses of unfamiliar territory. And in most cases, they had to make do with relatively small numbers of men. And not many people, I think, really understand how heavily they had to rely on indigenous personnel as porters and soldiers. If I have time, I'll say a little more about that. So all of this meant that new doctrines and modes of fighting had to be developed. And what I'm talking about here is what problematically we've come to call generically guerrilla war, or some of these other terms I mentioned earlier. And what's striking is that how frequently the doctrines of fighting these kinds of wars, and often the personnel who developed them, were transferred around the world and became sources of instruction and inspiration in different imperial spaces. This takes place at a formal level, and this takes place at an informal level of knowledge transfer. So I could mention a couple of other examples in this context. There's the recruitment, again, the recruitment and deployment of indigenous peoples, mostly men as soldiers and porters in police and paramilitary units. They did the bulk of the carrying and the fighting in the colonial wars of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, especially in Africa and Asia, less the case in North and South America. But they also served in different theaters of war. So the soldiers of Britain's Indian Army and also French Senegalese tirailleurs or riflemen, they're two important examples. They served across much of the imperial world. Another example I could cite is the development and proliferation of the modern concentration camp. And there's an emerging literature about this, the global history of the concentration camp. It's no accident that the modern concentration camp was developed in the context of colonial wars. There's also a global process of learning and adaptation among anti-imperial forces. Okay, this isn't just a dynamic that takes place on the side of the colonizers. And that's also the entirely rational choice. We don't think about it this way, but the entirely rational choice to fight guerrilla wars. Necessary and entirely rational. And I think there's still a lot to be learned about the extent to which anti-imperial forces shared knowledge, shared experience, and shared personnel. Now, one more quick point about methods and means, and that's the global arms trade, right? And this is something historians like Priya Satia, the Singaporean scholar, and Maurice Chu's have been looking into, right? The 19th century equivalent of the 20th century Cold War arms trade, a massive global trade in weapons, accelerated in the second half of the 19th century. With all kinds of very important implications for colonial wars. Okay, third, very quickly, and a lot could be said about this, there's environmental warfare. Now, there's nothing new about belligerents in armed conflicts destroying land and livestock. But like so much else about the technologies and methods of modern war, attacking the environment accelerated and globalized in the 19th and 20th centuries. Fourth, and I'll wrap this up, Lauren, there's ideology. You have material and strategic interests, of course, that are propelling 19th century imperialism, but you also have claims of civilizational and racial superiority undermined by fear. Fear in the white imperial world, fear of so-called replacement, right? And there are a number of best-selling books published in the late 19th century that are warning about the replacement of white peoples around the world by non-white peoples, using a language that would be instantly familiar to the contemporary transatlantic far right. So the specter of replacement completely terrifies white people. At the same time, it's not just white people who are reading about white replacement. It inspires many of its African and Asian readers. So colonial wars, and more generally imperialism and racism, are inspiring an increasingly global ideological response even before communism becomes a major anti-imperial force. So I'm thinking here of the emerging pan movements, pan-Islam, pan-Asianism, pan-Africanism. And that's, again, before we even get to communism. So that's I go into much more detail into all of these things in my course, Imperial World at War. I would love to hear what students and my colleagues have to say about this. And thank you for your attention. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Remy. So I'm going to talk really quickly about how we've decolonized the curriculum, the history curriculum, on the sort of superstructure, right, on the large curriculum, not on the course level, but on the curriculum level. And then we're going to open the floor to comments and questions. So I wanted to share my screen with you all and show you the curriculum as it's now in the bulletin, and tell you a little bit about the history of how it got there. So can you guys see my screen? Is it showing up? Okay, great. So there are two major things that have happened in the time that I've been at Brooklyn College, the last 8 years. When I got to Brooklyn College, and you can actually see this still in the unfortunate residue of it on the website. Can you see it's now the course list for you all on my screen? Okay, you can see in the course listings that it says ancient, medieval, and early modern history, and then modern European history, right? This is a very frustrating mistake that doesn't reflect the curriculum that you all take, which is that you take pre-1500 courses, which are from around the world. So Professor Meyer's courses on ancient China count, the shaping of the Islamic world counts, and medieval Europe counts, right? And when I got to Brooklyn College, it was ancient, medieval, and early modern European history courses. And part of that was because of the faculty who taught those courses. And part of it was because it was a residue of a kind of curriculum at a kind of time where the understanding was you needed to take Western classical cultures. You needed to take pre-1500s in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and then medieval Europe, and then go forward into the rest of European history. And so this residue that you see, this glitch on the website, is actually a little bit of residue of that, even though now you take courses in European history that are not just ancient, medieval, and early modern, but are anything. So modern Germany or medieval Europe are all part of that together. And so I'm going to go back to my, you guys see my department requirements page now? Okay, great. So you see that here, right? That lower division courses, right, require you to take 21 credits, and at least 3 credits are pre-1500. And part of the reason why we do that, as I sort of mentioned kind of in the chat, in a furious typing that was like, doesn't make any sense because I was listening to Professor Remy at the same time, right? One of the reasons why we have this Eurocentric mentality is in part because the history discipline descends from a moment in the 18th century during the Enlightenment, where an idea of what it was to be Western and rational was really being codified. And so, you know, lots of students in the shaping of the modern world, right, will read Thomas Macaulay, right, a British guy who's in India, and he says, why do the Indians need to read anything in Sanskrit, right? The important works in Sanskrit can fit on 1/4 of a library shelf. What's really important is that they read the great works of Western literature, right? And that mentality comes in part from the Enlightenment. But studying pre-1500 courses actually is part of a decolonizing mission, not just because you can understand what happened in ancient China, right? And that fills out your understanding of history, but also because an idea of Eurocentrism, an idea of the Western world is created in modern history and wasn't there in the pre-1500 period. And so how that idea formulated, in order to understand that, it's important to study that pre-1500 period. So that's in there. And then you see that we've reduced the categories, right, to be European history, transnational, United States, and then Africa, Asia, Caribbean, Latin America, and Middle Eastern history. And I want to show you one of the sort of how the sausage gets made, as it were. One of the things that the curriculum committee in the history department does is we submit these curriculum documents to a governance body at the college in order to change the bulletin. And so a document that we submitted in October is a document where we start to list in the bulletin all of the courses that count for European history and all of the courses that count for transnational history, all of the ones that count for US, all of the ones that count for this list D category 2. And the point of doing this in part is to just make it clearer for students what counts for what, right? But the other thing that we did is we thought about each course and we thought about what category it belonged in really critically, right? Modern Turkey, right? Is modern Turkey just a list D course? Is it actually Middle Eastern history, or is it also European history, right? So we had that conversation and decided to put modern Turkey in both European and in Listi, right? And so that kind of debate helped us to think about individual courses, right? When I teach, well, I don't teach. When Professor Johnson teaches America from 1945 to the present, is he talking just about America, or is he talking about other places as well? Is it an American history course, or is it a transnational course, right? How is he privileging America? How should he not be privileging America, et cetera, right? So we had those kinds of conversations, and we thought about things like Africa, right? Courses in African history ended up being just in this list D section, right? Africa is not a country, as we all know, right? So when we're studying African history, we're studying transnational history, right? We talked to Professor Day, who teaches the African history courses, and asked her if this was true. And she said, of course, this is the way that I teach this course, right? So we really thought about what are old, Eurocentric, Western-centric ideas of what these non-Western places were about were reflected in the curriculum and how we had to sort of redistribute all of that. Oops, there we go. Really quickly, 2 more things. So the other thing that we did was we thought a little bit about, and this speaks to what Professor Banerjee was saying in the beginning, right? That decolonization is not just about replacing and challenging Eurocentric views, but it's also about including things like race and gender and caste and ability, et cetera, in the curriculum. So we did that by changing some old course names, things like women's history became women and gender history, right? But also in expanding our colloquium offerings. So when I got to the college 8 years ago, there was a colloquium in religion, a colloquium in social history, political history, and economic history. No, not even economic history, political history and cultural and intellectual history, right? And then we were like, in 2001, do we learn any other kind of history? Do we as a faculty teach any other kind of history? And then we expanded to have all of these other different types of colloquia, right? So that we can have a course that's in global history or a colloquium that's in race and racism. And having these courses allows us to express what we're doing better as a faculty, but also inspires us, right? If there's a category in race and racism, suddenly I'm thinking, what kind of medieval history colloquium can I offer in the race and racism colloquium, right? And so that's important for the offerings that we provide also. The final thing that I wanted to share with you, just find my screen, find my list, is that we're also, as a faculty, aware of the fact that our faculty does not represent all the areas in the world at the strength that it should, and at all in some cases, right? So one of the things that Professor Napoli just asked the curriculum committee student representative to do, and that's Anuna Meme, who couldn't be here today, is to start circulating a petition around the student body to try to support the faculty requests for lines, which means faculty requests for positions, for job openings in hiring history faculty. So the history faculty every year asks Brooklyn College for more faculty members. And for since, well, I don't know, 5 years ago, I think 6 years ago was our last hire. That person, Professor Ibrahim, who specialized in the Islamic world, left the college and hasn't been replaced. And so one of the things we're doing is asking for a line in Islam, right? Asking for somebody who could study, who could teach and who studies the history of the Islamic world. And so Anuna is circulating a petition to support that request from the students. But we're also asking for lines in other areas, right? We're asking for lines in Indigenous studies. We're asking a lot for lines in Asian American labor history, right? We're asking for lines in areas of history in the world that will help better complete our curriculum, because not all of us can teach these other areas. So you as students can help with that, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A. That's my spiel. So we're going to open the floor now. So we would love to hear feedback that you all have, questions that you all have. We have a question already in the chat, 2 questions, which is like a two-headed question from Ryan Acosta in the chat that we can start with. I can pose it to the committee here or whatever. But then students, raise your hand, use your little electronic hand to raise your hand, pop questions in the chat, give us feedback, tell us what we need to do better, et cetera, et cetera. So the question from Ryan Acosta, who, full disclosure, is a Shaping of the Modern World student, has just learned about decolonization, is could there be times when decolonizing the curriculum could be bad, similar to the negative consequences when some areas, think Africa and the Congo, were decolonized? And are there times that colonies don't shed their colonizers' values, but rather adapt to their own values, outright keep the value the way it is? So this was in part in response to Professor Banerjee, but anyone can answer. Professor Banerjee, do you want to start us off? Oh, you're muted.
Maybe somebody else could speak on my, because Professor Troyansky, Wills, and Professor Rawson, they're all here, so they should get their fair share. I have spoken long enough.
Anybody want to speak to Ryan's questions? Is there a moment when decolonizing the curriculum is not appropriate? Is there a moment when the decolonization process should embrace the colonizer's values? Banerjee,
If nobody else speaks,
you should go for it.
Okay. Professor Troyansky. Yeah, Professor Troyansky. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. I mean, Banerjee could tell us a lot about subaltern studies and the way in which there are people who serve as intermediaries between colonizer and colonized, and it gets at both historical experience and identity. That there are people who serve in this intermediary position, and you have to ask, okay, what is your identity? Are you a kind of a public servant in the British colonial system? Are you someone who's going to become a major player in an independence movement? And it could be that people are really torn, and that so their identities, I would put it in terms of complicated identities in experiencing colonization, decolonization, independence, and then what happens later on when there's another generation